Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the orientation to the new Adult Education Matrices Part 2. Today is going to be focused on reasoning through language arts. My name is Shira Hillier. I work with Bloomboard. Last week, if you were on this call, you got an opportunity to hear about the new Adult Education Matrices in Math led by my colleague, Molly. If you have questions throughout today, my colleagues will be on available to support and answer those questions via the Q&A box. So a couple of logistics, a couple of housekeeping points to remember. If you have a question, please do type it into the Q&A option. As I mentioned, I've got a couple of colleagues who will be helping to field those questions today. Your microphones will be muted. This is listen-only mode, and today's presentation is being recorded. It will be archived and available on the IPDAY website within 48 hours. All right, so to quickly talk through our objectives for today. Over the next 50 minutes or so, we will work to understand the background and development of the new matrices, understand how the structure of the new matrices supports the guiding principles of the new standards frameworks, and think a little bit about how the matrices can support instructional decision-making. So our agenda, we're going to talk a little bit about that rationale and process for development. Then we're going to spend a good chunk of time digging into the structure and design principles of the RLA matrix. And finally, an opportunity to do an activity that supports some internalization. So for those of you who were on our call last week, part 1, this will look familiar, but I think it bears repeating just to kind of, particularly for folks who are new, but also to just kind of reground us in where we are today, how we got here, and why we have these new standards matrices. So as a reminder, in 2019, Florida Executive Order 1932 outlined a path for the state to eliminate Common Core and pave the way for a new set of K-12 standards. Those new standards were the Florida K-12 BEST standards, the benchmarks for excellent students thinking, which are now currently in the process of being implemented. There are some curriculum and assessments that are ongoing and utilized in classrooms already. As a result of that work, that prompted an initiation into a deeper understanding of the implications of that new framework for adult educators. And so during the fall and winter of last year, Bloomboard and IPDAY worked together with a committee of your colleagues, Florida educators and administrators from adult education and post-secondary programs across the state to develop a new set of adult education academic standards. Right, so that work was happening predominantly last fall in October, November, and December, with multiple strand-by-strand feedback loops to inform the development of those new adult basic education standards, which were then presented to the board in February of this year. And then leading into May, we were providing some support and resources around understanding those new standards. So we're continuing to provide additional support and upcoming future resources. And that includes creating new standards matrices. And so we worked on that over the summer, and now we're in the fall, we're starting to roll that out to you all as educators across the state. So a couple of kind of key considerations to keep in mind around the new adult education standards. These design considerations are going to help if you haven't yet had an opportunity to dig into the standards. This is going to help kind of frame what you're looking at when you look at those new curriculum frameworks. So one of the things to keep in mind is that the organization and terminology of the new ABE standards follow those of the K-12 BEST standards. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, but it does look and feel quite a bit different than your previous ABE standards. A second design principle or design consideration is around combining standards, right? As we know, each ABE NRS level is equivalent to more than one K-12 grade level. So in some cases where there were redundant or overlapping standards in BEST, they were combined, right? And as needed, right? Because NRS level 1 is equivalent to grade K and 1, NRS level 2 equivalent to grade 2 and 3, and so on and so forth. And so in these instances, the best benchmark that more comprehensively encompassed the full breadth and depth of skills was adopted, right? And essentially, this is something that right, essentially when you're taking the K-12 standards, that's the equivalent of 13 years of instruction. And so as we think about the needing to condense and refine those for adult learners, where you have this more concentrated period of time with students, you have to kind of pull out what are the most important skills and content to prioritize. And lastly, relatedly, the different levels. So there were instances in which content appeared in the K-12 BEST standards, but at a different level in some cases than was in the ABE standards. When that occurred, every effort was made to keep the content at the same level as in the previous ABE framework in order to support consistency around the use of current instructional materials and assessments. So this is kind of some design considerations overall across both the RLA and the math framework. We're now going to dig specifically into the RLA framework and even more specifically into the new standards matrix for RLA. All right, let's dig into a little bit of the structure and design. So as I mentioned, right, the organization and terminology of the new frameworks follows that of the K-12 BEST standards. So there used to be two ABE frameworks, reading and language arts. Everything has now been combined into a single curriculum framework called reasoning through language arts. Within that, you're going to see all of the new strands. So the previous ABE strands included foundations, reading, writing, and speaking and listening. The new strands are foundations, reading, communication, and vocabulary. You will note that there is no speaking and listening strand. In the previous ABE standards derived from CCR, the speaking and listening was a separate strand called out for its importance in developing strong communication and interpersonal skills. While there is no speaking and listening strand specifically in the K-12 BEST standards, and therefore not in the new ABE standards either, many of those skills around speaking and listening do appear in the framework, but they're typically embedded in the communication strand or in the RLA expectations, which are those overarching skills that are intended to be taught and supported throughout all of the strands. And just a reminder of the code. This is the coding scheme that you will see in the standards framework and in the standards matrix. So let's take a look at kind of the previous standards matrix. As I mentioned, there were two previous frameworks for ELA, one for reading and one for language arts. And so there were two previous standards matrices, one for reading and one for language arts. So as you can see, kind of, I know this is a little bit small. Oops, I apologize. Let me go back one. Nope. Nope. I can't go back one. There we go. So as you can see, right, the column on the left kind of grouped together multiple standards. So you can see, for example, the key ideas and details encompassed all of reading standards 1, 2, and 3. And so each individual cell within the previous matrix wasn't its own standard. It was more like its own discrete skill within one of those three standards in NRS level 1. So it's a little bit of a different look and feel. And what that then led to was the intention to create an activity resource for each one of those discrete skills. The new matrix feels a little bit different. I'm having a little bit of technical issue today. Let's see if I can make this work. There we go. All right. So note that in the new standards matrix, there is a single RLA matrix, right? That's consistent with there being a single RLA curriculum framework. And all of your standards are in one place, levels 1 through 4. I will note that there is not currently here a level 5 and 6, but we understand that additional resources, including considerations around levels 5 and 6, are important, and there is continued work to develop additional resources and support in those areas. For now, your current matrix that we're going to get a chance to dig into today include levels 1 through 4. A couple of other features here. So as I mentioned, the columns up top show the NRS levels. The rows show every single benchmark, and they're organized by standard and strand. Note, however, that the language in each cell is an abridged version of the full standard. That was done to support brevity and to be able to see everything on one page. So it's not a substitute for reading and internalizing the actual standards, examples, and clarifications. The best way to think about this is that it's more of a cheat sheet. Each cell does include the full coding scheme for the standard. That is going to help make it easier to then locate the full standard in the ABE framework when you are looking for it. For the most part, what you will see is that each benchmark has 4 individual cells that go with it for levels 1, 2, 3, and 4, respectively. On occasion, you will see that one level has 2 individual cells within it. There are very few instances where that happened. In the cases where it did, it was because we decided very intentionally to split that benchmark into multiple cells if there were clearly 2 distinct parts of the standard. So 2 very different skills, not just different text types or different elements, but 2 distinct skills. So in the case of the structure benchmark here at level 2, you can see they have the same code because they are part of the same standard. And when you look at that standard or benchmark rather in the RLA framework, you'll see them together, but we're separating them out to help clarify that they're really 2 discrete skills. One is about explaining how text features contribute to meaning, and the other is about identifying overall text structures of chronology, comparison, and cause effect. So we went over a little bit of the structure. I want to talk about the underlying principles. As a reminder, it's really important. This is what kind of underlies the individual benchmarks that you see in the matrix. So it's kind of a reminder that even though the matrix lists all of the benchmarks in levels 1 through 4, we want to make sure that each benchmark is in the context of these bigger underlying principles that constitute the framework overall. So we want to keep these rather than thinking about each individual benchmark in isolation. So a couple of really important things to call out here. First of all, this framework really emphasizes the importance of students being able to work with grade level complex text. That's going to come up multiple times over the next few slides. So I'm going to keep coming back to that, the importance of complex text. Secondly, grounding responses in evidence from the text. Thirdly, building knowledge of the world, developing research and technology skills, prioritizing foundational literacy, focusing on vocabulary, and engaging deeply with informational text. I just want to call your attention for a moment to those first 3 bullets as well as the last bullet. What you will notice about each is that they are absolutely connected to the types of texts that we are putting in front of students. So a big part of what we are considering in the context of reasoning through language arts benchmarks are the types of texts that we are offering students to engage with as they develop the skills that are embedded within each benchmark. I also want to call out a couple of things. Vocabulary is extremely important as it supports continued development of reading skills and also foundational literacy. So The K-12 BEST puts a particular emphasis on identifying secondary students who need additional support in remediation with foundational literacy. In the context of adult learners, that can apply in a variety of different ways. While in some cases it might be more applicable to those folks teaching ESOL courses, it's also important to remember that folks coming in at a variety of different NRS levels may have gaps in those foundational literacy skills. And it's important to kind of think about and identify if and where those gaps exist and support specific and targeted skills instruction there, because that's absolutely critical for folks to be able to become fluent readers so that they can fully engage with these grade level complex texts. What's going to feel new and different about the framework a little bit? In addition to some of the organization and terminology that we already went over, what you'll also see is that there's clearer continuity and vertical progression. So that exists in the framework itself, and then you'll see that reflected really nicely in the matrix itself. There's also simpler and more concise language, which again, you'll see in the matrix. It kind of helps us think about that simpler and more concise language also supports us in being able to better understand those vertical progressions. As I mentioned earlier, there is less emphasis overall on speaking and listening skills. They are not included in their own separate strand. It's something important to consider in the context of adult learners for whom speaking and listening is such a critical piece, whether you're working with English learners or whether you're working with students who we're trying to support for various post-secondary and career pathways. Speaking and listening, as we know, is a critical piece of that. So it'll be important to notice where those skills appear since they're not called out explicitly in their own strand. And lastly, there are a couple of new benchmarks. Not very many, but you will see rhetoric, which wasn't previously introduced in CCRs until level E. It is now introduced in level D, which is equivalent to NRS level 4, and then handwriting as well. So digging into kind of the substance a little bit more. As we said, all the benchmarks are in one place, showing that clear vertical progression from level 1 through level 4. And I named it, I pulled out that one that I was just showing you, central idea. I just pulled it out here and put it vertically so that you could see a little bit more. One of the things that the matrix helps us think about are the ways in which the benchmark progresses from level 1 through level 4. So just take a moment, take about 60 seconds or so, silent and solo, to read through levels 1 through 4 of the central idea benchmark that I just kind of zoomed in on here. And I'd love for you to take this moment to reflect on what you notice about the vertical progression here. Specifically, how the skills in level 3 build on the skills in level 2, and how level 4 builds on all of the previous content in levels 1 through 3. So I'll quiet my voice for about 45 seconds more and let you look through that and kind of reflect on those two questions. So a couple of things I'd love for you to notice here. First, notice on level 3 that one of the things that's different is that the central idea might be implied, right? So as we think about levels 1 and 2, in many cases, the texts that we are using in levels 1 and 2 are going to be less complex than the texts we're using in levels 3 and 4. In levels 1 and 2, those central ideas might be more explicitly stated. Sometimes they're really nicely stated right at the end of the first paragraph in the text, right? And so we can support students in kind of identifying and thinking about those. As we get to level 3, we are requiring students, the standard requires students to, first of all, engage with a more complex text in which the central idea might be implied. And secondly, apply more rigorous and demanding skills in being able to infer from the details provided what the central idea is, right? So it's twofold. Supporting, putting a text in front of students that might be more complex, in which the central idea is implied. And secondly, supporting students in drawing more inferences, which is a deeper level of analysis. And then same thing, notice in level 4. Students are going to need to navigate a text that has at least 2 central ideas. So again, increasing complexity of text. And those ideas may be implied. And we're not just now thinking about how the details support the central idea, we're also digging into a deeper level of analysis around craft and structure in relation to how the author is utilizing those details strategically throughout a text in order to develop the central idea. When we talk about the increasing complexity of the text, therefore, we're not just talking in terms of quantitative measures such as lexile, but we're also talking about the qualitative components of the texts that would lend themselves to this deeper kind of analysis. In addition, the new RLA matrix helps us see connections between and across benchmarks. So in the previous slide, we looked at vertical progressions from levels 1 through 4 within a benchmark. Now I have 2 different benchmarks that I pulled, one at level 3 and one at level 4. Once again, I'm going to give you just a kind of quiet 45 to 60 seconds to look at these 2 benchmarks and consider for yourself how the skills in the comparative reading benchmark connect to the skills in the purpose and perspective benchmark. So notice a few things here. Notice the connection between author's purpose and author's perspective. The author's purpose for writing a text and their perspective on the topic. Notice that the requirement for both of these standards, for both of these benchmarks, is that there are multiple texts on the same or similar events or topics. So for example, as we think about the purpose and perspective benchmark at NRS level 3, we're thinking about ways in which we can support students in analyzing an author's purpose across multiple texts. So multiple authors' purposes in multiple texts where we're looking at multiple accounts of the same event or topic. And in comparative reading, we're thinking specifically then about multiple authors' differing perspectives on that same event or topic. Again, we're called to think about the importance of the texts that we're putting in front of students, the texts that they're being asked to interact with, and the elements within those texts. We're thinking about the topics, and we're thinking about the skills and the ways in which the skills across multiple different benchmarks are mutually reinforcing of each other. So we have this consideration around the skills progression within and across benchmarks at different levels, and considerations around the selection and use of texts within the instructional materials and how they help support authentic teaching of these standards. The new matrix can help us more easily see some of these connections that can be made across with regard to texts, topics, and skills within the framework. So as we think about some instructional implications, right? We can think about it a little bit as the standards matrix is an additional tool that can help us think about, based on the level that we're teaching, what do we understand about the skill progression such that we can have a sense of what prior knowledge students might need in order to be able to navigate complex text at these levels and apply these more rigorous and demanding skills at this level with these texts. It can also help us see and kind of ask ourselves, where are there connections within and across the skills and knowledge in the benchmarks within this strand and across other strands? So we can see ways in which, for example, multiple benchmarks within the reading strand mutually reinforce each other as we develop those skills across. And similarly, which we're going to look at in just a minute, ways in which supporting our students as both readers and writers can be mutually reinforcing. So keeping that in mind, we're a little bit ahead of schedule. I want to give folks an opportunity to do some work digging into the new matrix. So we're going to create a little bit of space for some work time. Here's what that's going to feel like. In a minute or so, I'm going to share out in the chat with you all a link to the new RLA matrix. And I'm going to ask folks to follow steps 1 through 4, specifically focused on the argument benchmark, and to think about those two kinds of considerations that we just looked at. Ways in which we can think about progression, vertical progression within the benchmark, and ways we can think about connections within the strand and across strands. And then I'm gonna give folks about 7 or 8 to do some work time. And then we're gonna come back together, at which point I will close this out and pass it to one of my colleagues who has an exciting survey for you all to participate in. So let me start by putting the matrix into the chat. If you go into the chat, you should see a PDF of the new RLA matrix. If you have questions, please drop them into the Q&A, and I and my colleagues will take a look and support in answering those questions. We will come back at 35 after the hour. So that gives everyone 8 minutes of work time. Back together in one. Thanks. We're going to come back together in just a minute. Would love for folks who have thoughts to share out with your colleagues. Please do so by dropping them in the chat. We'll give just a few more seconds just to wrap up whatever reflection you're thinking, and maybe drop some notes into the chat. So already I'm seeing some great reflections in the chat. Take a moment throughout the next few minutes to review what your colleagues are sharing, which are really awesome reflections. I'll highlight a couple of things. One is that as we think about, in response to question number 3, as we think about level 4 of this standard, the ability to track the development of an argument. First of all, there's a pretty big shift that happens between level 2 and level 3, where it's not just enough to be able to kind of identify the claim and explain some of the reasons. We now really need to think about tracking the development of that argument. So really kind of that deeper level of interpretation and analysis, understanding the author's particular selection of different types of evidence and the placement of that evidence and the way in which that evidence builds on itself and each other in order to develop the argument. And as we get to level 4, doing that while also adding in that evaluation skill now, because we're also asking students to analyze the type of reasoning used and their effectiveness. So we're adding even yet another layer of now examining the extent to which the author's choices in the ways in which they developed that argument were or were not as effective. right? So quite a level of complexity. As we think about a couple of things in relation to connections to other standards within the strand, this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but there are connections we can see to the purpose and perspective benchmark, which at level 4 has asks for students to be able to also be able to track the development of ideas, right? How an author establishes and achieves their purpose through a variety of specific elements. And similarly, connections to central idea, ways in which we're asking students at this level to be able to track the development of ideas. So by the time we're at level 4, across the central idea benchmark, the purpose and perspective benchmark, and the argument benchmark, as well as others, we've really shifted into a deeper level of analysis where students are looking at not just the meaning in the text, but also connecting to the craft and structure and the ways in which authors are intentionally developing their ideas within the text. Yep, I see some of these reflected in the chat. Awesome, awesome. And lastly, I want to name one other connection. And again, this is not an exhaustive list, but one other connection to benchmark within another strand is in argumentative writing. So if we scroll down, and I know we've spent a lot of time looking at reading today, but as I mentioned, the RLA curriculum framework and the matrix here has all of the benchmarks listed. And one of the ways that's helpful is to think about ways in which we think developing our students in terms of being readers and writers can be mutually reinforcing. So under the communication strand, there's a benchmark called argumentative writing. And one of the ways we can see the progression of that benchmark is that as we think about the kind of parallel experiences of students reading increasingly complex text where they're analyzing authors' arguments while also working to using those texts as models in many ways for how they are going to develop their own arguments as they continue to develop their writing skills. So connections across, not just within the reading strand, but also within the writing strand as well. So again, that was not an exhaustive list, but it's helpful to think about kind of a reminder of utilizing the standards matrix to help with continued internalization and understanding of the framework as a whole, and the ways in which we can see skills progression within and across benchmarks at different levels, both within a given strand, multiple strands, and considerations around the intentional selection and use of texts within our instructional materials and the ways in which we have to have the right texts in front of students that are going to help support authentic teaching of these standards. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to wrap us up for today. Before I ask for your feedback on this time, however, I'm going to pivot to my colleague, Adriana, who's going to ask for your support in gathering some evidence as we continue to develop additional resources to support folks' understanding and utilization of the new standards framework. Adriana? All right, y'all. We're going to wrap up for today. Thank you again so much for your time. In a moment on your screen, you will see an opportunity to give some feedback. Please take a minute to fill out these 3 short questions. We very much appreciate your feedback. I know IPDE takes all of this feedback into consideration to continue to offer you, really helpful Wednesday webinars. So please take a moment to do that. And then we will close out for today. Thank you for your time.